Hello, welcome back to The Hatch. I'm Rosie Murphy.
And I'm Sammy Roth. This is the podcast where we talk about Lost.
This week we have watched Season 1, Episode 18, Numbers, and we have even more of an interview with David Fury, who wrote this episode.
Yep, it's the first Hurley episode of the season. We finally learn what is going on with his backstory, so let's get to it.
As always, we start every episode with hot takes, our gut reactions to the episode. Sammy, what is your hot take about Numbers?
So I just wanted to comment. So know that scene where Sam Toomey's wife, Martha, is telling Hurley all the bad stuff that happened to her husband?
Yeah.
So she said that the numbers were what he guessed for the number of beans in a jar, and that it was correct. If that is true, there were 4.8 billion beans in that jar.
No, you're exactly right. You are exactly right. When I was watching the episode here, I wrote down the numbers and counted the digits, and there were 10 digits.
I did the same thing.
How is it possible that there were so many beans in that jar?
I had to think about it. I thought, is that tens of millions of beans? Is that 100 million? Oh my gosh, 4.8 billion beans. What is going on? Anyway, David Fury had a great conversation with him. I don't think he thought that one through too hard.
Unless it was an enormous jar, it makes no sense.
Right, or there was like a very long decimal place, like he guessed that there were, 4,815.
But there wouldn't be like
0.161,
0.42 beans.
Right, I don't think so. I don't think beans work that way. Anyway, it's a minor point, but it caught my attention. Rosie, what's your hot take?
So my hot take is pretty simple, but it was just that I forgot how funny this episode is. Like, all of Hurley's flashbacks are pretty dark, but also pretty hilarious. Like that scene where he's talking to his attorney or his accountant in that high rise, and a man just like falls from the balcony above. I felt bad, but I was laughing at almost all of those instances. They're just so ridiculous that I don't know. Maybe it's just a gut reaction to laugh, or maybe it's meant to be funny.
I remember those scenes being really funny, like the first time I watched this. But this time I was much more horrified.
Okay.
I don't know. It's like, yeah, I get it. It's shock humor. And I asked David Fury about that when we talked, and you'll hear his answer to that, which is that they wanted it to both be, funny and tragic. But I just kind of found myself watching it being like, holy shit, this is so bad. Like, it's so over the top. I feel like it becomes funny at a certain point, and then it gets past that point and just becomes, like, gruesome.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's definitely dark. I don't want to make light of, many deaths and injuries, but is there a point at which you think it turns that corner?
I don't know. Maybe when the house burns down. Because he's just gone through that scene where he lists in the car, like, his brother's marriage broke up and his grandfather died, yeah. And a friend got struck by lightning at the funeral, and it's like, I'm watching that just thinking, Jesus Christ, like this is, and then it gets worse. But anyway, it's also funny, like I get it.
Yeah, no, you're right, but it just has that air of ridiculousness. Like a friend got struck by lightning, yeah. Are you kidding? Which, I don't know, it really helps me understand why this seems so unbelievable to so many of the people who meet Hurley.
Yeah. Because
each of these instances is so absurd.
Yeah. So this actually makes me think of a big question I had about this episode. And I assume we're going to talk about Hurley now, because this is...
Oh, yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, so the question I have is, Hurley thinks that the plane crash is like the latest and biggest example of the bad luck that he's facing, right? I mean, that's sort of the point this episode, that, he had all this bad luck, and then the plane crashed, and that was absolutely the worst. Is it possible to read this episode, and perhaps the remainder of the show for Hurley, but including in this episode, that the plane crash was actually the best thing that had ever happened to Hurley? I guess I was just thinking of all of the things that happened to Hurley in this episode and on the course of the show. Like, he meets Libby, he sort of starts to deal with his insecurities, like about his weight. At the first time we see him in this flashback this episode, he's sitting on the couch eating chicken and watching the lotto numbers. And we start to see in this episode he's becoming a lot more, like, proactive and looking out for himself and, like, trying to actually, solve problems in his life. And then at the end, of course, he becomes the new Jacob and seems very happy in that role. So I guess I was just watching this episode and thinking that, gee, this island thing seems to have worked out much better for him than everything else. And maybe it was actually, maybe the numbers actually did him a good turn at the end of the day, because they're ultimately what led him to the island.
So I see what you're saying. But when Hurley describes the quote-unquote curse, he doesn't say bad things keep happening to me. He says bad stuff keeps happening to everyone around me. Like the parameters of the curse seem to be that his presence makes bad things happen to other people, not bad stuff happen to him.
That's a good point.
And so that's why I think when he encounters the numbers on the islands and begins to conclude that the crash was his fault, he's not seeing that as this is another bad thing that happened to me. He's seeing that as this is something bad that happened to everyone else because I was on that plane.
That's a fair point. And actually that makes a lot of sense in light of his flashback where he personally is making like a shit ton of money from all of the bad things happening to other people.
Materially, at least, this is actually very good for him, although it, keeps whatever, whether we believe in the curse or not, keeps ruining the lives of the people around him. Can I sort of transition into a related point?
Yeah, my question is asked and answered. You have answered it.
So there's a question throughout this episode, right, of whether we believe Hurley, and who believes Hurley, I guess. Who's willing to buy into this curse, who's not. His mother is not. Sam's wife, who he goes to visit in Australia, does not believe in curses, right? But Rousseau is willing to meet him there.
I've lost everything. Everyone I cared about. So yes. I suppose you're right. They are cursed.
Maybe you're right. Maybe we are cursed. And it's not clear to me whether Rousseau is actually saying, like, I believe you, or whether she's saying, like, sure, if that's the way you want to frame it, I guess the numbers are to blame.
I think you're right that what's important is that that's what Hurley is interpreting her to say. He just wants someone to say anything to the effect of, there is something to the theory that is in your head. And so it's very easy for him to understand that that's what Rousseau is saying.
You have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone to agree with me. Thank you. Oh, God, thank you. Thank you so much.
And I thought it was interesting that after that, where you have that sort of, like, cathartic moment for him, then you get the scene on the beach where he finally, having had this good experience, sort of opening up about it, he tells Charlie what's happening, and it's really sad. Charlie just shuts him down super harsh. Which I wasn't expecting at all. Like, I'd forgotten that scene was there, and it's kind of jarring to see, after you've seen Hurley in this vulnerable spot, that Charlie is, comes off as pretty mean there.
So what's jarring about, I think, Charlie's reaction to Hurley is that that's only the beginning of Hurley's story, right? Like, all Hurley says to him is, back home, I'm worth
$156 million.
Yes. And Charlie, I think his reaction is reasonable. Like, hey, man, that's absurd. It doesn't make a lot of sense that would be true. Just like everything else Hurley's been through, right? None of it makes sense, including the winning of the lottery.
True. Like,
Hurley has been so steady. I think, like, such a steady presence on the island to so many other people, even though he hasn't been particularly, one could argue particularly helpful or a particular leader of the group. He's been, I would imagine, very reliable as sort of a source of comfort and humor and lightheartedness. And so when he sort of snaps at the beginning of this episode and demands to go find Rousseau and then sets off alone and really is way more set on this than anything we've seen, that definitely seems like it would surprise everybody else, right?
It does, and I mean, you get that great dialogue with Charlie where he says,
one minute you're happy-go-lucky, good-time Hurley, the next you're Colonel Bloody Kurtz. This doesn't make any sense.
And Hurley, sort of acknowledges that as well later, and when he's yelling at Rousseau, he's like, look,
But I just go along with it, because I'm along for the ride. Good old fun-time Hurley. Well, guess what? Now, I want some friggin' answers!
And yeah, it's a side of him we've never seen before, and it's a side that I don't think we knew existed.
The other thing he keeps saying is, I'm not crazy.
Right.
I'm not crazy, you have to believe me. And that, we haven't gotten into Hurley's institutionalization or any of that yet. But that does seem to be a motivator here, right? The desire not only to believe and not only to be believed and have sort of the validation of being believed, but also to be perceived as not crazy. And that, in large part, is probably why he hasn't told anyone about this, right? Because you start saying, I played these numbers in the lottery and now I'm cursed. You sound a little crazy, right? By the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, and of course we sort of learned this episode, at least you can infer that he was in this mental institution. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the sort of defining paradigm for Hurley here being wanting to be heard and understood.
Right. Well, and beyond that, carrying the guilt of, I think I caused this plane crash.
Yeah.
Which he's not the only person who does that, but that's quite the, psychic weight to bear.
Yeah, that's interesting because Charlie makes that point at the end of, look, you're not the only one with, with guilt. You're not the only one who has, gone through terrible things. I'm a drug addict. I was shooting up on the plane. Do you think that that's a fair point from Charlie, that Hurley needs to, at least a little bit get over himself here, or do you see him as carrying, an even heavier burden than everyone else in some ways? Because he certainly thinks he is.
So I think one of the things that Lost structurally does really well is it avoids ranking people's trauma, right? It avoids saying, boy, Sawyer just had a real shit life and his life was the hardest. Or, boy, Charlie really kind of had it easy and he screwed up and we should blame him. Or, it could very easily become this ranking of who's had it easiest to who's had it hardest. And I don't think the show does that. Each story is unique, and structurally, I don't think the writers want us to say Charlie had it harder than Hurley, or Hurley had it harder than Charlie, or whatever. Although I think Charlie is definitely engaging in that here. We don't see a lot of this in the show, but I do think there is an immaturity to the weight that I bear is heavier than the weight that you bear. Does that make sense?
It does, and I agree with you completely. I think you're right that the show strikes that balance really well. Unfortunately, I now very badly want to spend time thinking about who had the worst suffering. Who had the worst pre-island life? First candidate who comes to my mind is Michael, and I don't want to have that argument again, but I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah. So, is there anything about this episode that was different for you in hindsight?
So I was just, I was falling down a little bit of a Hanso Foundation, the Lost Experience rabbit hole. Remind me, you didn't get into the Lost Experience stuff, right? Between seasons 2 and 3? Or between seasons 1 and 2? Yeah, so there was this whole thing, and I had to look it up a little to remind myself, but the whole thing with the radio tower just, got me thinking oh yeah, so why was it that the radio tower was broadcasting the numbers to begin with? Because that's sort of the root mystery here. Hurley finds out that, okay, it was this random radio tower broadcasting these numbers. But the reason that was given in the alternate reality game, the Lost Experience, for that, was that the numbers were the core numbers of something called the Valenzetti equation, which is supposed to predict, the termination of humanity, when humankind would destroy itself. Oh. And that the Dharma Initiative was trying to change one of the values of this equation, to change the numbers so as to stave off the destruction of humanity by itself. And so they programmed the radio tower to play these numbers, to broadcast them out to their other people who were working with them off the island. And so that if the if the broadcast changed and they heard some other number, they would know that the Dharma people on the island had successfully changed the equation.
Wow.
Which I had totally forgotten about. And I was so into this at the time. And I was reminded also that, on the blast door map of the hatch that we're going to see next season, there's, references to the Valenzetti equation. So it was kind of worked into the show. But I loved being reminded of that and remembering that that's sort of the initial explanation here. And I feel in a way it's connected to these numbers being bad luck if they predict the end of humanity.
That would qualify, yes.
Yes.
You know what I would like to do is
you want to hear from David Fury.
I want to hear what David Fury thinks about this episode.
I knew it. I knew you wanted it. Yeah, he wrote this episode. I talked to him. We had a great conversation about it.
I can't wait to hear it.
So we've talked about some of the mysteries. We've talked about special. Let's talk about Numbers, the first Hurley episode. Which did you write or you co-wrote? I think.
I co-wrote it with Brent Fletcher, who is somebody our script coordinator on Lost, who I brought over from Angel. I had worked with Brent there. Brent's now a writer in his own right. He's writing I think he writes for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. now. But at the time, he was script coordinator, and I wanted to give him a script because he was great. He was always somebody who gave me good notes on my scripts, and I thought he deserved he wrote an episode or two on Angel, and I thought he deserved to have a Lost episode. So we joined up and wrote one together.
So this was the first Hurley episode, and it comes kind of late in the season. I think it's like episode 18 before you get any backstory. I mean, did you have by the time you were working on that, did you already have a sense that Hurley was like a fan favorite? This was kind of going to be a big deal to get Hurley's backstory?
Yeah, it was. I think that was clear from the pilot that Hurley was going to be a fan favorite, and that did not change. He was fun to write for. Jorge was great, and knew that part, but still knew nothing about him. I mean, still wrote him as a comic relief. A guy who's much more of the everyman, a kind of a, we did the episode where maybe it was.
You're talking about the golf course episode?
The golf cart, yeah.
Yeah, that was
course.
in Solitary.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that was something. That was a notion of Brent's, Fletcher. He had that idea, and so I ran with it in that. But so we had fun with Hurley, but I didn't know anything about him. And when it came time to write that episode, still didn't know anything about him. So there was a lot of Damon and JJ and I going out. I remember we went out for lunch, and we were like trying to break his story. And I believe it was JJ that talked about him winning a lottery, I think. Hurley was actually one of the easier characters to write.
Oh, interesting.
Because to me, he's me. I mean, there's a lot of characters that have a lot of baggage, and the thing about Hurley was, he was just kind of, like I say, he was a little bit of an everyman. He always had the great lines, like, what you feel you'd say if you were in that situation, kind of,
Dude, you've
talking
got
about
some arse on you.
Yeah, exactly. So I felt a kinship for his character already. So I didn't find that. And then once we hit upon this idea of these mystical numbers and Hurley having been in an institution, and I mean there was a lot that got crammed into that episode. I think that all we had at that point, the only vague notion we had was Hurley was going to go on a road trip essentially, or into the jungle. Hurley was going to have to venture into the jungle, and he was going to run into Danielle, the French lady or something. That was the notion. But we didn't quite know why until JJ came up with the numbers thing.
Right.
I remember it being fun. I remember it being a fun episode to write. I think I wrote the first half and Brent wrote the second half, and then we switched, and then we got some notes, changing up some stuff, and then I did a pass on it. But overall, I knew it was going to be full of humor, which is always something that I love. But once I went to 24 after that and never got to do humor again for a long time.
I loved 24, but it was not funny.
Yeah, it was not funny. So yeah, it was just an interest. So it suddenly became a fascinating. I guess what the thing is, it was a surprise for me. It was I knew Hurley was a popular character, but I was surprised how popular the episode was. And I was surprised I really was surprised how much the numbers took off and became such a thing on the show. They were just, it felt like, oh, okay, fine. Okay, mystery numbers, great. I didn't really think like, I wonder what this is going to be. And that turned out to be this crazy thing where somebody actually played those lottery numbers, those numbers from the show, and won the lottery somewhere, I think locally in California.
Yeah, I kind of remember seeing that.
Yeah, because a reporter came to my house, some news reporter came to interview me about the numbers. Because those numbers were just numbers I pulled out of episodes. They were just random numbers from episodes that I pulled out. Everything but 42, which was an homage to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But the answer to the ultimate question seemed appropriate for Lost.
Do you remember?
There was nothing but questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember what it was? You said you came up with the numbers. What was it in your mind that said there should be these recurring numbers?
Well, I needed, I think 7 numbers or something. It didn't mean, again, recurring numbers was not the issue. It was just,
Okay.
for me, it was just writing the numbers in this episode. Okay, there's these lottery numbers that Hurley heard from a guy who was in an institution who heard those numbers being broadcast. That's all I knew, and that's all of us knew. We didn't really knew what it meant yet. So the numbers I chose were first number was 4, which was the years that Locke was in a wheelchair. You know, he says in Walkabout, 4 years. I've been in the chair for 4 years. So I took that number 4, and then it was, I think, 815, which isn't it Flight 815, Oceanic
Yep.
Flight 815?
Yep.
So it was 8 and then 15, and then it was, I think, 23,
Yep.
which was the in Tabula Rasa. The reward for Kate's capture was, I think, 28,000 Australian dollars, 23,000 Australian dollars. It was a weird amount. It was something I just remembered in Tabula Rasa that there was a weird amount for her reward that I think was 23,000. So I took 23, and then it was another number. I can't remember all of them, but they were always taken from an episode. I think the gate. I think 18 might have been a number, which
16 was the other one.
Yeah, 16, and I think 16 was the gate at the airport that Flight 815 left from gate 16. I think. Anyway, they're all related to an episode, and everybody can look through all the episodes to figure out which are which, with the only exception being the last number being 42. Which was a Hitchhiker's reference.
Oh yeah, love the Hitchhiker. And so then you just decide at the end, wow, it would be cool if we stamped these on the hatch. Wouldn't that be mind blowing?
Yeah, that was the last thing I had to actually. In fact, I had to fight for it because some people thought we don't need it, and I went, no, we need it because now nothing connects to the island. You know, it's interesting in Hurley's story that he won a lottery with the numbers, and it's interesting to hear they were broadcast, but it has to connect to the island, and the most pressing thing at that time was everybody trying to get into the hatch. That was while Hurley was doing his thing, they were still working to get into the hatch. So I said, hey, what if those numbers are etched in the hatch? And again, I had to push for it until eventually they relented, and I think it made for a great ending to see the.
But yeah, I mean, it made for one of the most popular mysteries of the whole show.
Yeah, didn't know it at the time, but yeah, that was cool.
You know, and so I want to talk about the numbers being cursed. I mean, so the stuff in Hurley's flashback, I mean, to me it's like pretty over the top. The house burning down and the cops show up and arrest him, and his grandmother breaks his ankle. Like, it's just kind of relentless. You know, I'm curious why you decided to go that route, just to pile on so much. Were you playing that for, I guess, did you intend that to be played for humor, or was it really tragedy? What was the intention there?
It was definitely meant to be humorous, but it was also meant to lay into Hurley's guilt that he feels the plane crash was his fault because of those numbers. You know, so it added a layer to his character, his own, that there's a sense that there's a secret guilt that he feels because everybody around him died. The bad luck generally happened to others. I mean, you remember he's in the office building and bodies are falling out the window. A guy falls past the window and stuff. And I mean, so his bad luck is largely other people around him are, suffer terribly because he used those numbers. And so it worked. It definitely worked for comedy. I mean, I definitely thought it was the cursed numbers. There was some fun in it. But when you take it again, everything needed to relate to the island. It wasn't enough to tell a backstory where it's a self-contained backstory. Everything had to then spill out onto the island. So, like the numbers spill out onto the island by being on the hatch, or Hurley's sense that the numbers are cursed spills out into his whole experience on the island and his relationship with others because he thinks he's responsible for the reason that they're there. That's the reason that everybody's there. That's the reason people have died already. It's because of him and because of those numbers he used. So it played for tragedy on that end, but it just played to his character. He was a sweet guy who tried playing these numbers, and suddenly he's cursed. And there's nothing more interesting than a cursed multimillionaire. It's like I've got, it's classic monkey's paw. It's like, yes, you have all the money in the world, but your son is killed. You got the money because your son was killed. So that was Hurley's story, as a guy who was haunted by the fact that, yes, he had a great windfall, but at terrible cost.
One thing I enjoyed was that I didn't realize this until I rewatched it the other day, but you know the whole episode. He's won the lottery and he's clearly rich, so you get that that contrast you're talking about. But then it's not until the end where he finally tells you how much it was. That it was $156 million, and then it's, it's like, oh, that really.
Yeah, you're thinking maybe that's a few $100,000 he won, or maybe even $1 million. But
yeah, I enjoyed that you left that until the end.
Yeah.
I
think that was Damon probably.
Okay.
Just want to give I want to give credit where credit's due.
Gotcha.
I think it was Damon who had us saying the number at the end.
Gotcha. And speaking of the end, the other scene I wanted to ask about, having to do with Hurley's guilt and his curse is the scene with Charlie at the end, where Hurley tries to tell him, "I caused the plane crash," and you think that we're finally going to get this sort of confession of, "Here's how terrible I feel about this." But really what happens is Charlie doesn't believe him and kind of yells at him and just walks away before he can. And it's kind of demoralizing. What was the goal with that scene?
Just more of the curse thing. You can't even win for trying. He's trying to unload his terrible burden, and he can't, because who's going to believe that he's a millionaire? Who's going to believe this guy's a millionaire? Like, no one. So he can't even. You want to kind of unburden yourself and say, listen, I want you to know I caused a plane crash. Forgive me, but forgive me, please. It was because of these numbers I played, and people aren't even willing to hear that or listen to him, or, So it's just that, it's darkly funny. It's the idea of the guy he can't win for trying. He wanted so much to tell somebody, and they just didn't believe him.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, agreed. And so I'll back up a minute, and there was one other scene I wanted to talk about in this episode, and you mentioned earlier the scene with Hurley and Rousseau, where he's going out to find her, and I guess I thought that scene was really interesting, where he, she sort of convinces him that he's not crazy by confirming that the numbers are a thing, and she's heard the numbers, and he's really grateful, and it reminded me very much of the scene in Solitary, where Saeed and Rousseau are kind of giving each other what they need emotionally, and kind of Saeed has to convince her that she's that she's not crazy. And so I guess I'm just interested in whether
what you're saying is I'm a one-trick pony, is what you're saying. Okay.
Well,
you're probably right.
Okay. I will tell you that when I wrote down that question, that was before I realized that you'd also written Solitary. So not my intention.
Okay. All right.
My intention with the question is one, whether there was an intentional parallel, but more broadly, just sort of what you saw as Rousseau's role and how you thought about bringing her in to serve a purpose with our main characters.
Well, I honestly did not consciously see any parallel, and you certainly have those episodes fresh in your mind than I do. I haven't seen them in many years, so it certainly wasn't intentional. But I think obviously Rousseau is meant. He's looking for someone. He's looking for some kind of absolution, as I say with Hurley. He tries to confess it, and he can't get any absolution. But he needs to explain. He needs to know why these numbers have cursed him. Or is he crazy? Am I just crazy? And it's not knowing that sometimes can really be the burden. Not knowing something, not having confirmation, and that Rousseau was able to give him that. Just told him, it became a theme in this thing where he thinks I'm just crazy. I'm crazy. Everyone thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I'm just crazy. And she was able to tell him, you're not crazy. Those numbers are cursed. Those numbers are horrible things, and it's suddenly that's an absolution for him. That's something that's like, okay, that helps me so much. Then the numbers are cursed. They do have a power that has affected it, and it's not me imagining it. It's not me. So and coming from Rousseau, being this character from the pilot, from the the mysterious message. I think it's the pilot, or the end of the pilot.
Yeah, it was.
The end of the 2 hours. It was just, again, I love being able to tie things together. I love being able to bring the past together with the present and see people we've seen before. It could have been anyone else who did it. It could have been somebody else, but allowing it to be Rousseau, because for me, I wanted to see her again. I felt she was, I used her in. Obviously in Solitary, but I wanted to see her again, and I thought this was a great opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I agree, and I just, without saying that you're a one-trick pony. I just I appreciated the use of Rousseau, who is this wild, crazy woman in the jungle, to be more than just this mystery figure, and to also actually have these real significant interactions with the characters and sort of play a role for them. I thought that made her more interesting than just the crazy woman whose voice was on the recording.
Sure. But isn't it wonderful to get absolution that you're not crazy from a crazy person? It just seems so apropos. It's like, she's nuts, she's insane, but she's telling me I'm not insane. Oh, thank you, crazy lady of the jungle. I'm not. You've given me something to actually cling to.
I really liked what David said about what Hurley's going through in this episode in terms of being a lottery winner, being like ridiculously rich and yet being cursed, and how that is a particular rock and a hard place to be stuck between. Like, not only is he cursed arguably and has to convince people that he's cursed, but he also has to convince people that he's absurdly wealthy, which is like an additional measure of suspended disbelief required on the part of his co-islanders. I just thought that was well said.
It was, and I would expect nothing less of the individual who wrote this story. The only thing I wanted to just note about that, what David Fury said, is just I loved how he came up with the numbers. The fact that it was going back and finding numbers they had already used. And what I love about that is that, for fans of the show, when there was this big reveal that Hurley used these numbers to win the lottery and they're on the hatch, it's like we all went back and like, oh my gosh, that number showed up here, and that was what the reward for Kate was, and that was what, the gate was at the airport. And it was just like this sort of reversal process of like, oh, it's crazy that the numbers showed up in all of these other places. Like, what's it mean? When in reality, that's just where the numbers came from in the first place.
That was great and makes these numbers a lot more fun, I think.
So I just enjoyed that bit of, sort of behind the scenes sort of television trickery of making us think something.
All right, well, we can go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for tuning into The Hatch. Next week, we are watching Season 1, Episode 19, Deus Ex Machina. Long awaited. We've been storing up a lot of John Locke thoughts over the last few episodes that I know I'm excited to discuss.
Oh, gosh. Deus Ex Machina is amazing. I'm so excited for this episode.
So if you want to watch that episode in advance and call us with your hot take, we would welcome it. We are at 9546 Dharma. You can also record a voice memo on your phone and just message it to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/thehatchpodcast. We are also on Twitter at The Hatch Podcast.
Yes, our cover art is by Danny Roth. Our theme music is by Andy G. Cohen. Please rate and review us on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you. It helps more people find the show. And we'll see you next week.
Namaste.